Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Network 2020's virtual briefing today on the digital battlefield, AI's influence on modern warfare. I'm Joanna Gwozdowski, Senior Program Advisor here at the network, and I will be moderating today's discussion. First, for those who may not be familiar with Network 2020, we are an inclusive international community that bridges the gap between the private sector and foreign policy worlds. We provide a variety of programming, so please visit our website at network2020.org to learn more about our various offerings. And now I would like to introduce today's panelist. Dr. Herbert Lin is a senior research scholar for cyber policy and security at the Center for International Security and Cooperation, and Hank J. Holland Fellow in Cyber Policy and Security at the Hoover Institution, both at Stanford University. His research interests relate broadly to policy-related dimensions of cybersecurity and cyberspace. Some of the other positions that he holds include Chief Scientist Emeritus for the Computer Science and Telecommunications Board at the National Research Council, and Adjunct Senior Research Scholar and Senior Fellow in Cybersecurity at the Saltzman Institute for War and Peace Studies at SIPA, Columbia University. And in 2016, he served on President Obama's Commission on Enhancing National Security, Cybersecurity. Dr. Heather Roff is a senior research scientist at the Center for Naval Analysis and Associate Fellow at University of Cambridge's Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence. Previously, she was a non-resident fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. Her research interests include the law, policy, and ethics of emerging military technologies, such as autonomous weapons, artificial intelligence, robotics, cybersecurity, and more recently, quantum, as well as international security and human rights protection. She is the author of Global Justice, Kant, and the Responsibility to Protect, as well as numerous scholarly articles. And finally, Mr. Wendell Wallach, Carnegie Hero Fellow at the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, where he co-directs the Artificial Intelligence and Equality Initiative. He holds a number of positions, including Emeritus Chair of Technology and Ethics Studies at Yale University and Fellow at the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technology. Previously, he was the founder and president of two computer consulting companies, Farpoint Solutions and Omnia Consulting. He is the author of numerous publications, including A Dangerous Master, How to Keep Technology from Slipping Beyond Our Control. So welcome, panelists. And as a reminder, if you have any questions for the panelists during discussion, please submit them to the Q&A. So with that, let me begin. We are seeing the rapidly growing impact of artificial intelligence in our daily lives. Militarily, in the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, weapons such as drones and other new technologies are being effectively deployed on the battlefield. Overall, how is the geopolitical landscape being affected by these developments? How reliable are autonomous weapons, and what challenges and opportunities do they offer? What will be the impact of potentially removing the human factor in decision-making? And what are the important legal and ethical questions that are raised by AI? And do we have the answers to those questions? I look forward to discussing these and other issues with our esteemed panelists today. So if I may begin with you, Herb, we build this discussion as one on AI and warfare, but it is important to distinguish between the non-lethal military applications versus the military lethal aspect, as well as related terminology. Could you please briefly provide the difference between the two and how this discussion will focus on the latter? Also, how does the role of intelligence fit in?
Intelligence, by which you mean the analytical, collecting intelligence and so on? Okay.
Correct.
All right. You'll have to remind me to come back to that. Military applications of AI span a very broad range. So certainly at one end, there's the question of putting in artificial intelligence into the target seeking and killing aspect of military operations. But military applications also include electronic medical records for soldiers and logistics, maintenance profiles, and so on. And I haven't heard anybody raise serious ethical issues about those things, even though they are supposed to support the military. And at least the ethical issues are different significantly different than they are for lethal autonomous weapons. And so when you talk about lethal versus non-lethal, it's not a hard distinction. There are gradations in that. So if I have a system that proposes targets, and like reportedly is what's going on in Israel right now, it proposes targets, and yes, people have, quote, the discretion to say no, but do they really under stress of operations and so on, those kinds of questions. And of course, it's better than, for the victim's standpoint, for the target standpoint, it's better not to be on that list than to be on the list. So there are all kinds of questions about AI as to where they, where on the continuum you want to draw the line. I understand this panel is mostly on the lethal side of it, but it's important to note it's not a binary distinction. And the closer you look at it, when you look at it closely, there are always sort of edge cases that you have to worry about.
Okay, and as far as the intelligence, how does that fit into?
Well, intelligence is basically another way of saying, where's the data come from? AI systems are based on data. If the intelligence comes in saying, everybody who's black should be a target, well, then you wind up only killing black people. Now, is that the fault of the AI or fault of the intelligence? I mean, it's a bug in the system. That shouldn't be happening, right? But the data feeds are a critical part of this.
All right, well, thank you so much. And then now turning to you, Heather, the AI and warfare industry is forecast to spend about $40 billion over the next 5 years. What type of weaponry and new technology does it include?
Well, thanks, Joanna. So I think a couple of things. One is putting the 40 billion in perspective. It sounds tremendous of that amount of money, but in reality, it's not. And so when you're looking at, for instance, the National Defense Authorization Act that was just, sent through Congress, is going to go through the House soon. That's an $874 billion budget for 1 year for the DoD. And that has nothing to say about other countries and what they're spending on defense. And so if you're looking globally at defense industry spending, 40 billion in 5 years actually is rather low. So that's one thing to kind of keep in mind. Now, how that money is allocated and what types of weapon systems that they're going to develop is also a bit of a sticky wicket. Mostly because what we're going to be seeing is investments in smaller type projects, right? You're going to be seeing investments in demos, and you're going to be seeing investments in prototypes. That's in particular in the United States, because that's also a holdover from several years worth of National Defense Acts that require more prototypes and demos to be fielded before any major acquisitions program for a new weapon system is developed, because the DoD, at least in this case, wants to see proof of concept before they sign off on any sort of major acquisition of a weapon system. And so when you start kind of putting that all together, what that really looks like is you're going to see lots of small pockets of money going to a wider basket of different types of capabilities and systems. When you're looking at things like not just if we're moving from demos to prototypes, then you're looking at really trying to scale up and put into place either a rapid acquisition. The acquisition system in the United States is pretty crazy, but depending upon if you're looking at a technology that's slightly more mature and that you can kind of acquire faster versus a really, really new emergent capability that you're doing demos and prototyping and then trying to field small quantities of. Now, that being said, what type of weapon systems are we really looking at? Well, as Herb alluded to, right, like when it comes to autonomous systems, the United States has a long history of using automation in their weapon systems. And we have autonomous weapon systems. You know, our policy, the DoD's policy 3009, caveats a certain amount of systems that would be considered or fall under autonomy, and says it doesn't apply to these types of systems. So mines, for example, or cyber non-physical systems, right? So it caveats those. When we're looking at automation and things like precision guided munitions, you're going to see, again, probably follow-ons to existing weapon systems. So block 1s, block 2s, upgrades in that instance. And then you're also going to start seeing more and more of these kinds of loyal wingman programs, right? So when you're looking at autonomous systems that will be supervised by a human pilot or a human supervisory role, where they're in support for either intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and have weapons effects on them, either for a particular mission or for defensive purposes. But then you're also going to start seeing other types of systems. I think with the war in Ukraine, there's a lot going on with the kind of rapid acquisition of attritable systems or throwaway systems. And so looking at drones, right, unmanned aerial vehicles of one sort or another, these are with higher orders of autonomy in different functions. You're going to see investments in those, right? We have that already happening within the DoD. And then you're going to start seeing, I think, more investments in naval systems, and you're going to have more investments in space-based capabilities, right? Because you need autonomy in space, and you need autonomy under the water. So that's where I think a majority of the systems are going to come from. But again, in terms of specific types of weapon systems, there isn't, I think, on the horizon, like a giant big bomb with a big red button that we're worried about, right? It's a diffusion of capabilities across systems, and it's a diffusion of capabilities of networking those types of legacy systems together in new ways, giving them different types of communication abilities or different types of target prosecution, even if, as Herb alluded to, even if those targets are acquired and approved beforehand by a human.
Thank you. And if I can just follow on, would you say that the United States really is the most advanced in these two particular areas, talking about space and naval, or are other countries as competitive?
It depends on the domain. So, you know, if you're looking at, I would say that the United States is quite capable in leading a lot of the charge. But that said, that, you know, the US has the largest defense budget in the world, right? And we throw the most money at different problems. And when you look around the world at different countries and you're looking at their defense budgets and where their assets need to go, right, they're going to prioritize one area over another. So if you look at England, for instance, you look at the United Kingdom, they're going to prioritize more defense spending on naval systems, right? They're not going to put a bunch of money on land-based systems. That's just not their game. If you look at Australia, for instance, they might be investing more heavily in space and in maritime, right? And they might be relying on the United States to bolster different capabilities in different areas. And so, you know, the Netherlands, for instance, has a very good maritime component. And so I think it's more wise. And, you know, Canada, for instance, is going to look at different types of things. So where they're going to put their money, where they're going to put their eggs is where they're going to excel, right? And so if you're looking at kind of a general level of competence across all domains, then yes, the US is leading. But you're going to see pockets of specialization depending upon what that country's capabilities are generally and what they lean into more.
Thanks so much for that clarification. That's very interesting.
Sure.
And now we're going to change tack a little bit with you, Wendell. You know, this is another aspect of AI and warfare. What are some of the ethical considerations that, you know, you've been grappling with and others, and how do you think they compare with past considerations when there were other emerging technologies in warfare?
This is not an easy question. There are many ethical considerations, and there's both benefits and harms or risks that come from deploying AI within the military domain. So the question is largely about whether any of those concerns should prevail over others. But obviously, people prioritize their concerns differently. Some people their job is to prepare us to ensure that there is security and prepare us for the possibility of war, if not the inevitability of war. And there are others who are very much in the business of trying to make war as humane as possible. So on the benefits side, you have arguments about more exacting targeting, more precise targeting, which hopefully would be less civilian casualties. Certainly precision targeting is better than dumb bombs. Another advantage is the obvious one. You can use machines to fight your warfare, and you presumably or hopefully will lose less personnel from that warfare. On the negative side, you have things such as the possibility that the machine, the lethal autonomous weapon, it's not just lethal, it can cause loss of limb and many other harms, but these autonomous weapon systems will escalate conflicts in ways in which the political and military leadership had not intended. Or another one might be that it could actually start a new war if it made a decision that happened in the absence of full information or human review, and that decision precipitated a totally new war. So these are the broad areas we get into. But the more specific consideration is around whether we can humanize warfare at all and what it means to restrict lethal autonomous weapons in that context. So for more than 2,000 years, we've had the growth of what are known as international humanitarian law, or the laws of armed conflict, and they're largely directed at protecting civilians. Excuse me for a second. And they have been codified by Geneva and Helsinki agreements. And the basic argument is that it's implicit in the laws of warfare that we have humans making the decisions about lethal autonomous weapons. My apologies, I've had a bit of a cold. So that's the central core ethical concern, and many of us think that overrides everything else. Furthermore, the laws of conflict ensure that somebody will be accountable.
Mm-hmm.
We cannot assure that with artificial intelligence.
All right, thank you, Wendell. We can come back to you and let you recover there. And then I'll turn to you, Heather. You know, how can AI be put to positive use in the context of international security? We just heard some of the ethical challenges, but what are some of the positive uses, and then what are some of the legal concerns?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the easier way to do that question is to talk about legal concerns and then talk about positives, right? Because they kind of flow differently into one another. And so on the international humanitarian law front, right? Well, there's actually two different bodies of international law that relate to states. So you have international humanitarian law, or the law of war, as being one, which are agreements between states, right? These are voluntary. There are customary norms, as Wendell has alluded to, that have developed over a series of centuries. But for the most part, when we're talking about, you know, black letter law, these are voluntary agreements that states sign on to. Then you also have international human rights law, right, which is a much broader purview of law that requires different types of actions than the law of war, right? Because you're assuming more of a peacetime or a police action than you are an international armed conflict, and an international, not a non-international armed conflict, which is a different dimension as well. So when a state is at war with, say, insurgencies or things like that within its own borders, and not wars between two states and over borders. So there's different rules that regulate all of that. So all of that is to say that all of these bodies of law have resulted well before anybody was thinking about machines taking actions or taking decisions in either police actions or international armed conflict. So when it comes to AI in this instance, really what we're talking about is, can you create a system that complies with the existing rules, right? So can you create a system that is discriminate, right? That can target between combatants and non-combatants. And so when we talk about civilians, this is a good handle, but really what the law requires is combatancy. And combatancy under the law is whether or not you're engaged at that moment in hostile activities, right? Oftentimes, we use different types of ways of understanding what hostile intent is, right? Because it's really hard to understand hostile intent. Ask any soldier at a checkpoint, right? If someone's coming towards you, if they are hostilely intent or not. So international law has done things like say, are you wearing your arms openly? Do you have a gun on your shoulder? Do you have a military insignia on you, right? So are you a participant in the hostilities? As wars have become more complex and shifted in different ways over the years, utilizing insurgent tactics, utilizing not utilizing emblems on war on their uniforms. So this is like the little green men, right, of Russia invading Ukraine. You have all sorts of these different types of pushback against the law. So as AI enters the fray, right, now you have to ask whether or not these systems are going to comply with the rules or bend or shape the rules in different ways. And a notorious difficulty when it comes to AI and targeting, for instance, is the ability to target hostile combatants, right? And so you can target military objects, right? That's permissible. So tanks, right? Missile launchers, things like this, because the object by its very nature, purpose, location, or use is a military objective. And so that's not really under much scrutiny, right? When you're thinking about it, like, can I target a warship? Can I target a tank? People tend to say yes. It's where the gray areas come in are, can I target people? Because that's where that combatancy issue comes into play. And using AI systems to target people is going to be notoriously difficult and challenging. If a human has a hard time figuring out if someone is a hostile combatant or not, it's going to be equally hard to find the right types of data to train that AI on to equally say that this is a hostile person. Also equally difficult is our facial recognition systems, right? We see that the underlying data structures and the way that they're trained sometimes don't actually pick up on the things that you think they're picking up on. So facial recognition isn't going to be easy either. So behavior recognition, facial recognition, these types of things are going to be notoriously difficult to say that this complies. So the law itself is pretty silent on the means and methods of that, right? Like, can you demonstrate through a weapons review that this system complies, right, with discrimination and proportionality? If you can, then it would be considered legal. There is movement in the United Nations over the past 7-8 years to ban autonomous weapon systems carte blanche. The body with which this question is undertaken is the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. That entire body within the United Nations requires unanimous consent, right, to pass an additional protocol. So all the states would have to agree or refrain from voting and abstain to an additional protocol banning a weapon. And there is no fundamental agreement among states about banning autonomous weapon systems. There are majorities of states that say, I want this. And there are minorities, depending upon if you think numbers versus power versus money. But it is highly unlikely that you're going to get a ban coming out of the convention on conventional weapons. And so that's one thing to look at, is the law on that side. Now, the use of autonomous systems in international human rights hasn't been as well addressed as it has in the laws of war. Some work on drones, for instance, has been, or remotely piloted aircraft, kind of the war on terror, the global war on terror stuff. There has been a lot more ink spilt on that, but not so much on autonomous and AI. So the legal questions are one side of it, right? Now, the beneficial uses of AI, right? Because the law says, I'm going to say no to these things, where the law is silent, everything else is permitted, right? And so you can kind of, it's an unfortunate event, but that's what it is, right? Where the law is silent, everything else is permitted. Beneficial uses can be wide-ranging, right? So everything from logistics and transport to humanitarian disaster and aid, you can think about things like that. The question is how it's deployed and whether or not it's appropriately deployed, and whether or not the AI system of what it was trained for isn't being used in an off-label use in some way that makes it inappropriate and has unintentional harms, right, that result from the use of that system. So climate might be a good one to start thinking about, you know, massive climate models and where we could see aid being distributed. You could think about a lot of things. Battlefield medicine is another one. Robotics for evacuation, things like that. Robotics for disaster relief, right? Things like the Fukushima Daiichi, you know, like that type of horrible disaster, and using robotics and autonomy for those types of tasks. But it's really, I mean, it's a tool, right? And every tool depends on how you hold it, whether it's a weapon or whether it's a tool.
Thank you so much. Yeah, no, there's so many variables and complexities here. It's not straightforward, obviously. Now, if I can turn to you, Herb, something you've written about the possibility that in a globally competitive security climate, the introduction of AI into lethal systems will spark an ethical race to the bottom. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Sure. Just imagine that us and some adversary, Albonia, okay, have equal levels of AI technology in their weapons. Okay, they will program their AI weapons and operate and use their weapons with their understanding, with the Albonian understanding of the laws of war, what they apply and what they don't. And we will do the same we program our weapons and use our weapons in accord with what we think the laws of war say. Okay, so you have a scenario here where you have equal levels of technology, but of course, how you program those weapons, makes a difference. And if you posit something which I think is true, generally, maybe some exceptions to it, but in general true, that if you make these weapons less sensitive to the nuances of the laws of war and so on, if you operate them with less regard for the laws of war, you could make a good case that they would be militarily more effective. More collateral damage, but so what? I kill more valid military targets. And so in that environment, I suggest that there's a good chance that if the Albonian understanding of the laws of war is more lax and less restrictive than ours is, they will have military advantages with their AI weapons because they operate them with less regard for the laws of war. If this is of course assuming that there's equal levels of technology. Now, if we go, then how long are we going to be able to sustain our compliance with the laws of war amidst that pressure? And I think that it's you can see the temptations to relax your own interpretations too. And so that I worry that creates a dynamic in which it's a race to the bottom. That's the concern.
So then how does the United States deal with such a situation? What would be your your suggestions, your thoughts on how do you deal with that type of, is that country then seen as a rogue country? Or, how do you deal with that?
Well, I mean, there are nations that violate the laws of war may be seen as rogue countries, but what are the practical consequences of it? It's not clear. There are cases when pressure to comply with the laws of war influence behavior, and there are other places where it doesn't. And so I don't know how to answer that. I mean, the only answer in some sense is to stay ahead of the other guy technologically. But that's a very hard game to sustain over time. And so you sort of have to presume that you are more or less at the same level of a sophisticated adversary's technology as well. I don't see a good solution to it. That's what I worry about.
I mean, I can definitely say on the US side, right, that it's a desire to comply with existing treaties and laws of war, right? But it's also a desire to be prudent, right? This is also self-serving. So you don't want to field systems that are inherently unpredictable, because that means they're inherently unpredictable to your own forces, right? And so when you're looking at forces that are allied, right, green and blue forces, right, you're not just thinking about unpredictability as it applies to red forces, to adversary forces. And so inherently unpredictable isn't that great, right? You might say, we're willing to take a risk benefit calculation. Now, I'm not saying I advocate this. This is the logic here, right? That, if I can bound the system in such a way that there are boundaries that I have accepted certain risks in for unpredictable behavior, it's unpredictable in X, Y, and Z axes, right? It's not unpredictable tout court. And so in that respect, right, I think that's where a lot of the systems testing and verification and validation goes to, right? Like, what are the physical bounds of the system, right? And so from an engineering standpoint, at least on autonomous weapon systems, right, it's the thing that worries people is not the big boom, right? We have weapons that go boom. We have big weapons that go boom. What is worrisome is the conglomeration of the lethal effector or the non-lethal effector that is still very risky, as Wendell has pointed out, with the decision aid portion of it, right? With the targeting acquisition or the decision to fire, right? And so in that respect, if it's a platform, a physical platform, it's going to be, in some instances, and most instances, limited in size, weight, and power, right? So what's the physical endurance? How long can it stay up or afloat or whatever? So it's limited in its power consumption. It's limited in its physical size. It's limited in its communications bandwidth. It's limited in its payload capacity, right? And so all of those considerations go in. And in some reasons, like this is a natural bound, a set of boundaries. And then you have, at least on the US side, right, you have concepts of operations and concepts of employment, right, that are required before you go into an acquisition of any major system. And so what is the thing I want? Why do I want it? And then how am I going to use it, right? All of those questions have to be asked a priori beforehand, right? And so where I think the delicate balance goes is the desire, and not just the desire, but the legal requirement at this point to demo and prototype quickly and fast. And so in that respect, that's that legal push to kind of throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks is actually, it runs contrary to the traditional mindset of what is it that I need? Why do I want it? How am I going to employ it? Right? Because the spaghetti approach just might, hey, I have an idea, let's see if it works. And I'm not thinking through all of the con-ems and the con-ops, right? I'm thinking through just, can I technically do it? And then I'll find a use for it, right? And so that's where I think some of the risk calculation becomes tricky, right? And then on the reliability side, right, you have multiple questions of reliability for that race to the bottom problem, right? You don't want inherently unpredictable systems. You want reliable systems that will act in a certain way reliably, consistently, things like this. but you also need to be able to test and verify and validate those systems. You need to have data that the thing is going to do what you think it's going to do. And right now, the state of play, the state of the art in testing and verification and validation of autonomous systems is nascent, right? Like there is no real state of the art. I mean, all you have to do is look at the fact that Tesla has just recalled a ton of vehicles because their autopilot sucks, right? And so there's all sorts of problems with effectively testing, right? And not beta testing, which is, again, we can go back to Tesla, I'll poke fun at them, right? Not beta testing your technology on an entire population and then just being like, oh, few people died, that sucks, right? So you don't want to beta test your things on your products or your weapon systems or anything else on a population. You want to have that testing done beforehand, right? Legally, the United States is committed to doing that, right? We go through weapons reviews. States in the international system that have signed on to additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions also have that, right? They have said, we will go through these legal processes, these legal reviews to ensure that they comply with the laws of war. But that's weapons, right? Everything short of that thing that goes boom on the end doesn't have to go through a legal review. So if you're looking at target acquisition, right? You're looking at automatic target recognition that still has a human somewhere saying yes or no. That ultimately is not rising to the level of lethal autonomy, right? That is a decision aid. And that decision aid does not have to go through weapons reviews. And that decision ultimately lies with a human somewhere and multiple layers of humans that are making those decisions on a political basis and a strategic calculation, and not necessarily on what the actual AI system is recommending, because AIs do nothing but optimize, right? And if you are asking for the optimization of something, they are going to optimize for it. So keeping that in mind, right? The thing that goes boom is really bad, but there's a whole host of other things that enable all the big things that go boom that are equally more complex and more nuanced and can be just as devastating, if not more so, if you're saying, well, there was a human here. Okay, but it's still going to result in massive, massive casualties.
I'm afraid that we perhaps are burdening our listeners with the complexities here of targeting and whether these machines should be deployed or not. And I think that's good to the extent that it's making everyone aware these are not simple questions. There are many factors that come into play, but I happen to think there's a bottom line here. And the bottom line really is international humanitarian law. And it's basically whether we are going to free future wars to be without accountability, without constraint, dependent upon the speed of weapon systems whose decision-making process we do not fully understand, and in many cases may be false, or whether we are going to move in the direction of trying, even if we may fail, but trying to the best of our ability to make warfare more humane and to give non-combatants a fighting chance. And I think that becomes a central question here. I'm among those who believe that the nature of artificial intelligence, at least at this stage, and I don't know about the future, at least at this stage, is it's unpredictable. It's not always controllable. And those factors may become more and more true in the future. Furthermore, the unpredictability of artificial intelligence gives the human standing behind the system the ability to say, well, I didn't know it was going to do that. So we have been in a movement over the last 10 or 20 years where there has been a dilution of accountability, not just in military context, but there's been a dilution of accountability in our societies very broadly. And what we are suggesting here, at least those of us who believe that there needs to be a treaty that restricts some forms of artificial intelligence, is that we reintroduce accountability and ensure that there's a human even if they believe the artificial intelligence is the extension of their will and intention, that there is a human who is accountable, culpable, and potentially liable if the systems fail. And I think that's what there's a high probability of us losing. Now, will people violate international humanitarian law? Look at Ukraine. Look at what's happening in Gaza right now. The actions of both Hamas and Israel are abhorrent in the context of international humanitarian law, but they become justified in the minds of those who perpetrate them because they see their survival at stake. Even survival may not be a justified reason to put tens of thousands of your own civilians' lives at stake because you decided to commit an atrocity. That's a cynicism that I don't think we can allow going forward. So there will be violations of international humanitarian law, but I think we also have to strengthen the uproar from the international community when that happens. And I think we have evidence to believe that that reaction, while not always constraining, often is. So my concern here is that we strengthen international humanitarian law by restricting the deployment of systems that can choose their own target and destroy those targets without meaningful human control. Now, let me go one step forward. Meaningful human control isn't just what happens at the moment of that decision. As I think Heather was alluding to, there's a whole constellations of decisions that go into the development of systems, the design of systems, the deployment of systems, and even the decommissioning of systems, all of which have to come into play for meaningful human control. And problematically, there's very few countries that are actually even have the intention, let alone the wealth, to put that full infrastructure in place.
Actually, Wendell, and also if I can follow up about something Heather was talking about the United Nations trying to create a regulatory framework. And I know this is something that you have a great interest in, especially with recent events at the United Nations. Could you talk a little bit about that, please?
Sure. Well, as Heather mentioned, there were many years of meetings that both she and I have been involved in under the auspices of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, which oversees arms control agreements. It is not part of the UN, but it functions within the UN system. So people tend to think of it as the UN, and it meets at the UN in Geneva. And after years of meetings, they did come up with certain principles or broad standard constraints, but they did not come up with any meaningful constraint, any treaty to restrict the development of AI in the military context or lethal autonomous weapon systems. So there's been a reaction from many of the states to that, frustration with that. And that set in motion two initiatives. One's called REAIM, which was initiated by the Netherlands and South Korea, and I think has more than 50 countries that are aligned with it, including the US, which has resisted any treaty at all. So there's this ambiguity about what the US's role in REAIM will be. But then soon after the establishment of REAIM, there was pressure on the UN to bring in its own initiative. So the General Assembly asked the Secretary General to convene a body basically outlining what autonomous weapon systems and what kind of constraints might be considered. Now, in general, nothing of this is new. This is just asking for an updated report that the General Assembly then will look at next fall. We have no idea whether that report will actually recommend any meaningful constraints, but then there's still the question of, if so, who's going to enact them? Now, let me give an example of frustration with CCW in the past, and that was over landmines. And the the inability for CW to restrict landmines gave rise to something similar to re-aim that took place outside of the UN system. It was known as the Ottawa and Oslo Accord. And basically, they put a ban on the use of landmines. Most countries signed that. The US did not sign it, but has said that it will abide by it. But that's the kind of universe we're moving into. So on the one hand, there are countries who are developing more and more sophisticated uses of AI in warfare, and on the other hand, there's a large number of countries that would like to restrict that. Now, I do think Herb has a very good point when he says the problem with AI at all in warfare is that it has been hyped as if it makes much better decisions than humans, and humans might defer to the judgment of AI even when they should not. And that requires much more rigorous training of those officers who will be working with AI systems. And that does not have to be a lethal autonomous system. That may be what Israel says that it's now using in Gaza, which is a targeting system that then humans make decisions about those targets. So it's still in human hands, but are the humans just deferring to the AI decisions, or do they understand the limits of those AI systems?
Great. Thank you so much for explaining all that. We have a little bit of time left here for a Q&A. There were a lot of questions about accountability, which is something that was covered. But here's a little different type of question. Someone asks, how can AI be used to manage the aftermath of war, especially pertaining to management of displaced persons, that type of thing?
I'll take a crack at that. The use post bellum is usually what it's called when we're talking about justice after war. The use post bellum framework is not really well fleshed out generally. Philosophically, we could talk about it one way, but legally and practically, it's really not very well fleshed out. There are different types of institutions that are required, and a majority of those institutions fall in the United Nations framework, right? And so when you're looking at UNHCR and you're looking at different types of organizations that unite, the Red Cross and things like this, all of these organizations are extremely underfunded, number one, right? So when you're looking at that, and then you're also looking at the fact that displaced people have to have a place somewhere. And that requires a coalition of the willing, right, of which states are going to accept those refugees and under what conditions. Unfortunately, the history of the world, not just the last 10 to 20 years, is that most states don't want to take refugees, period. They impose caps and limits and from different parts of the world to others. And so AI managing that, on the one hand, AI could be quite useful in an optimization standpoint. How do I get aid? What types of aid? What are the shortest distance between 2 points kind of calculation? But politically, there has to be the will, right? There has to be the will for states to do this, and there has to be the money to fund international organizations to actually provide aid and to provide succor to migrants and to displaced persons. That's just been not a very good thing. The other part of use post bellum that often gets underlooked and underappreciated is the voices at the table, right? And so when you're looking at things like disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, or DDR campaigns, right? DDR campaigns often look to who are the combatants. Can we get them around the table? Maybe we can have some sort of peace building exercise at the end. But often those are very fundamentally underrepresented by the people whose lives are ultimately affected, right? So you have a majority of powerful men in those positions, and you do not have representation of women in any way, shape, or form, more often than not. And you also don't have a representation of civil society groups that are there that are actually doing work on the ground. And so when you're looking at how to build effective peace, oftentimes the people whose voice really should matter most are not even part of those discussions. So AI can help in a lot of ways for optimization problems, for strategic things like that, but not for political will problems. And that's something to Wendell's concerns, right? That there has to be a normative impetus for the international community to push harder on those types of questions, because AI is not going to help with whether or not you want to save people or help people who don't look like you, who don't have the same set of problems as you, who live on the other side of the world.
Thank
So
you.
Heather undermined what is clearly the biggest issue, the lack of political will. But there's another side to this. And when we're talking about refugees, we aren't talking about just warfare. We're going to have climate change refugees on a score that is unimaginable over the next decade or so. But the problem of refugees and AI has been that AI can help in a lot of individual cases. For example, you might help people find families, or you might actually search the database you have on where different members of a family are. But you may not be able to ensure the security of the people who are in your database. And that's been a big issue already for the International Committee of the Red Cross and other bodies in the use of AI. And it particularly becomes an issue in a wartime situation where if your database is crackable, then you may be putting people's lives in jeopardy who are actually in your database because you want to provide services for them. So this is a whole other level that comes into whether AI can be a benefit or whether AI may actually lead to its own disasters.
Well, and to follow on that, Wendell, right? Like the United States, I mean, over the 20 years the United States was at war in Afghanistan, they pretty much surveyed the entire male population, right? Military age male population, and have biometric data on every single one of those men, right? And so, having that data housed is incredibly risky. But there's other things too, right? Of targeting particular groups or minorities. There's other things around just the way in which I've done a lot of work in my previous life as an academic on looking at gender-based violence in refugees and humanitarian disaster situations. And so there's a lot that goes on around that without just a giant database, but a giant database makes it a little bit more of a desirable asset to get to do your malicious deeds.
Yes, I think that's a whole different subject matter, right, for another webinar, because it is a big topic to cover too, AI and the post, as you say, postbellum. Another question, and this probably is more for you, Herb, since you're at a Institute of Higher Education. How do you explain to researchers and administrators in higher education institutions the risk of AI without being misunderstood?
I'm sorry, I don't quite understand the question. You asked about how do I talk about AI to administrators?
Yeah, well, I guess the question really is how you would, when you teach or when you speak to students or your colleagues, how do you discuss the risk of AI without people misunderstanding, what your views are? I guess because of the controversy surrounding the lethal use of AI.
It's very hard, but what you have to do is you have to clearly differentiate. Say this is what person X says, party X says, and this is what party Y says, and you draw the contrast. I often leave it to my students at the end of the year to say to me, well, what do you think I really believe? And if they split equally on it, then I think I've won. But that's about the best you can do. First thing is you have to understand what the facts are, and they have to know, for example, what a lethal autonomous weapon is. And you know, they have all these images in their head of what it is, but often that isn't what it is. And so that's where it starts.
Right, thank you. So this will be the final question, and it'll be just, you know, as brief as you can be, because it's for all three of you. And I will start with you, Wendell. You know, what should our goals be in the short term for managing all the different issues surrounding AI that we have discussed today, and also in the long term, if possible?
Yeah, the long term becomes particularly difficult because there's a lot of hype and confusion around whether AI will or truly can pose existential risks to humanity. And unfortunately, what that has done is clouded our ability to address some of the more present challenges. So the present challenges are things like lethal autonomous weapons, but they're also the embedding of AI modules in all kinds of control systems that most people don't even know they're there, and therefore can influence decisions without that necessarily being recognized that they are having an influence, and sometimes biased influence. So I think we're in this kind of very difficult time, and I would wish, and I think Herb touched upon it in his last question, we need the society to be in a crash course to understand more deeply what's going on, and to have at least enough knowledge that they can discern the difference between an opinion and a discriminating or critical viewpoint. And I think that's sadly lacking.
Thank you. Thank you, Wendell. I think that you're absolutely right. I definitely could use a major crash course myself. Herb, your thoughts on that? Short-term goals for managing these issues?
I have to echo what Wendell said: more critical thinking, less jumping to conclusions. First, understand the facts on the ground. Understanding that the facts on the ground are subject to interpretation, but it's important to distinguish between a fact and an interpretation of the fact. You want to challenge me on the facts? Okay, let's talk. Let's look at that. Then we can argue about whether or not what the interpretation, what the understanding is behind it, what the person's intent is, all that sort of stuff. But first, try to get some common ground.
Great, thank you so much. And then lastly, Heather, your views?
I mean, I agree with what Wendell and Herb have said. I think on the one hand, more critical thinking, but on the other hand, an acknowledgement that language matters. Words matter. And so how you describe a system, whether you realize it or not, it carries a lot of baggage, right, with what you think that system is doing, or what the system is capable of doing. So I often, when I used to teach, or even when I give informative lectures, right, and explain things, I might have an AI tool that's really great at doing my taxes, right? It can fill out the forms, it understands the numbers, it looks for all of the things that I can save money on. Great system. But I wouldn't trust my investment portfolio and my retirement decisions to my AI tax tool, right? Like, they're fundamentally different types of cognitive thinking skills and tasks, right? So I think understanding that these systems are limited in scope, right? And the words that we use, like decide and trust and all of these things, trust is a very multifaceted term. It carries with it all sorts of kind of hidden expectations of how a system will behave and things like that. And so the critical thinking side is very much a part of it. But the other side of that is being very self-aware, really trying to drive home self-awareness that most of the time the AI systems that we interact with are designed to make us think less, right? They're designed for attention optimization. They're designed for us to be lazy. They're designed for us to be complacent, right? I've written a book in my life. I've written a whole bunch of articles. So have these two gentlemen, right? It takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of hard thinking to come up with some of this stuff. But now we have this thing like, oh, I'll just ask GPT-4. It'll write it in a second, right? And that type of laziness and complacency, it breeds an intellectual laziness as well. And so if we're asking people to be critical thinkers on the one hand, and we're providing all of these incentives for them to be complacent consumers on the other hand, you find yourself in a really, really bad situation. So I would say, like, when you're using AI tools, always kind of think about what the limitations of those are, and then trying to press upon others, right? Don't just take whatever they give you as gospel, because half the time it's just nonsense. And so more than half the time, if you can flip a coin and get better outcomes, that it'll be rational or nonsensical, right? And so I feel like having that kind of critical stance, just generally going into life in this new kind of area in which we live, would do everybody a host of good. Everything from the clickbait headline and you don't read the actual story, to looking at survey results. Who did they survey? What were their p-values? Right? Like, if you only surveyed 10 people, this is not generalizable to a population, kind of thing. So I just think that understanding a little bit about math is really important, right? Understanding a little bit how statistics works will give you a huge leg up into understanding AI systems, because most of these systems are highly probabilistic mathematical systems. So critical thinking, a little bit more math. Don't be afraid, right, to ask questions and to dig a little deeper. A lot of this stuff is really complex and that turns a lot of people off, but that shouldn't stop you from learning and from trying to just figure out ways of questioning. That's a good goal.
Great. Thank you so much, Heather. And that's what we'll have to unfortunately end on. We had a lot more questions in the Q&A, but we've run out of time. But I want to thank you, Heather, Herb, and Wendell for a fascinating discussion of a very complex and controversial issue. But I appreciate all the insight that you shared with us today. And then finally, I just want to do some quick housekeeping we have some upcoming events coming in the new year. One will be Strategic Shifts Unpacking Taiwan's Election and Global Relations on January 16th with Dr. Karis Kempelman. And then we have another event scheduled for January 23rd, looking at the US, China, and the new geopolitical landscape on innovation, again on January 23rd. And finally, we are a nonprofit, and we love to bring you these free virtual briefings and love to continue to do so. So 'tis the season for giving right now, and I hope you'll consider donating your support to Network 2020. We're not 2021. Anyway, thank you so much again to our panelists. Great discussion, and I wish everyone a great rest of your day. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye, everyone. Lovely to see you. Don't be strangers.